seated. Good evening and welcome to you all. A special welcome to the parents and family members who are joining us this weekend. I remind you that after the lecture and a short break, there will be a question period with the lecturer in the junior common room directly behind me. I'm very pleased to introduce our lecturer, Joshua Cates. Mr. Cates is an alumnus of St. John's College, class of 1980. He received his doctorate in comparative literature from the State University of New York at Buffalo in 1991. He was a member of our faculty here in Santa Fe from 1991 to 2005. Since 2005, he has been an associate professor of English at Indiana University. Mr. Cates has published widely on themes in phenomenological philosophy, deconstruction and French post-structuralism, the philosophy of history and temporality, and literary and film criticism. These publications include two books, Essential History, Jacques Derrida and the Development of Deconstruction, and Fielding Derrida, Philosophy, Literary Criticism, History, and the Work of Deconstruction. Here at St. John's, it is worth noting that Mr. Cates is one of the few scholars actively working and publishing on the thought of Jacob Klein, the former dean of St. John's College, who is best known for his contributions to the history and philosophy of mathematics. Over the years, Mr. Cates has delivered lectures on both campuses on a wide range of topics. I myself have gone back to reread several times a trilogy of very fine lectures he delivered about 10 years ago, titled Getting Their Numbers, on the relation between mathematics and history, or temporality, in the thought of Husserl, Klein, and Derrida. Mr. Cates was a wonderful colleague, and I have often said that there has been no tutor I have been more sorry to see leave the college than Mr. Cates. But I temper that sentiment with the knowledge that all the good things that can come from this education neither can nor should be restricted to our two campuses. I consider him one of our own, wherever he may be, and I am very grateful that he is back joining us this evening. His lecture is titled Holism, Philosophy, Language, and Things. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Cates.
Hello, thank you so much, Walter. That's a very moving introduction. Thank you all for coming. And it's great to see so many people I know and miss, and it meant so much to both my intellectual and other aspects of my life, and I'm glad to see more people than that as well. But thanks. So let me say a few things. The first one, almost by way of a caveat, the last time I gave a talk here, I put aside my written text, and numerous people came up and said, oh, that was the best lecture you ever gave. So I thought I'd save some time and not work I'd work from notes rather than a written text, and hopefully emulate the feat of last time. But I hope that doesn't result in any confusion. I also want to say, following up on what Walter mentioned, that I am, as they say these days in the jargon, my value added, my distinctiveness is in part that I was a student on the Annapolis campus. I taught here and then left to make my way through the hallowed halls of academe. But I mention that because when I was here, and it may have changed some, I was looking at the reading list, but one of my pet peeves, or one of my concerns, let's say, was that in part because of where the reading list stopped, there was an absence of a kind of bridge between St. John's and the current humanities in particular. And it was, maybe I shouldn't say this on Parents' Night, but as a graduate of the college, it was certainly difficult for me to make the transition into graduate school. I'm not the only one like that. And there was a sense of wanting to make that easier for our students here. At the same time, especially now, having spent a lot of time in the humanities in an English department, I think that students with our education would be invaluable circulating in the larger academy. I think it's really it would be really good and important and helpful for the thinking that needs to go on there if people have read as widely as our students and as carefully were part of that discussion. So, and people may, I don't know the current state of play, but that's all by saying that this is sort of a version, a little version of that bridge that I thought it would be good to build for us. And which is to say that it covers holism, the topic, sort of what's gone on in philosophy pretty much since where the reading list ends off. I know you're doing a little Heidegger now and a little Wittgenstein, and that I'll be talking about. And it situates itself in what's come to be known as the linguistic turn, which is fairly true to its name, that language as a topic, as a subject matter became of quite great interest to philosophers of all stripes, though in very different ways. And holism is a product of that. I mean, I'll just to, since I'm being abridged, the linguistic turn, by the way, is sort of over, but it's lived on in various forms. A lot of what it's was asking or thinking about is now taken for granted. It's in the arsenal or quiver of your day-to-day philosopher or English professor, often in ways that they don't completely realize. And holism occurs, it takes shape in that context. And before sketching it a little bit more, I just want to say quickly two very different kinds of reasons why I bring it to your attention, why this version of thinking about language philosophically and things seems to me interesting in its own right, leaving aside what people are or not doing or have done recently. The first is that, as you are all aware, most of you, those of you who are not freshmen or sophomores, juniors, that certainly in modern philosophy, debates between idealists and realists, various theories of truth, correspondence and coherence have been the coin of the realm. What do I mean by these things? I mean correspondence. People usually say it's that truth is somehow receptive correspondence to things out there as they are. Coherence, it makes sense on its own terms. Idealists tend to say that our thinking makes the world what it is. Realists know we find the world the way it is. And holism, as I understand it at least, and as I'm going to present it to you, and so we'll take my word for it here now, is that gets beyond those oppositions. One of the last figure I'll discuss, Donald Davidson, speaks of correspondence without confrontation. And even to quote the words of none other than T.S. Eliot, don't ask me why it's relevant here, I can tell you during the question, it's a kind of new realism that sort of combines and overcomes those different divisions or oppositions and lets us, so that, and you'll be hearing a lot about truth, still speak about the way things are, but without thinking that there's a pre-formed or ordained or simply standalone version of that without any sort of thinking or language contributing to it. So that's the first overall reason. So I find it, in a word, philosophically powerful. The second overall reason is that, it goes back to this theme of the linguistic turn, is that, especially in the form it came to be known in literary departments, and it became associated with people in French post-structuralism like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, but others as well. And this was not really what these people were saying, but nevertheless, this was the kind of shorthand version that people took away, namely that language made everything what it was. Language constructed our world, that what everything was based on language. Now, the problem that I was raised was, what about language, right? If everything else was constructed by language, was language then the one solid thing, the one in itself that was left? Or how did you account for it? And so holism, again, in my interpretation of it, which, by the way, it's not controversial since it's not well known and I haven't engaged in controversies, but it certainly isn't canonical either. So, there are other ways of reading these figures than the one I'm going to offer you. Is sort of the moment when the linguistic turn gets rid of language. So, in some way, in this gesture, it completes the linguistic turn. It's not it's not like we've gone back to medieval universals, but at the same time, language itself is no longer a given, an entity, a root, a cause, in the same way that people came to believe it was. As I say, some of these people, like Jacques Derrida and others that I work on, I don't think that was their point anyway, but it was certainly believed to be their point. So that is another side, and why I think it's just worth thinking about and talking to you about. This is very dark light. Wow, not have it shine in my eyes would be the ideal thing. But to introduce you to the whole, I'll tell you overall, we'll see if we have time to do all of this, but in fact, let me take off my watch so I have some idea how much time I'm taking. But that we start at 7:30, I'm going to have to get used to that. So that I want to speak a little bit about Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, some of what he said in Being in Time, to lay out a version of holism. I will then briefly make reference to Wittgenstein, who will kind of set us up in part for the discussion of Donald Davidson, and then I would like to at least, I hope there's time to say a few more general remarks at the end. So, confining myself here mainly to the first part of Being in Time, which is Heidegger's big first book of 1928, is, as many of you know, devoted to describing a structure called being in the world, which is hyphenated for those of you, so it's being in the world. So it's already holistic, right? What are the hyphens doing there? They're to try to tell you that being and in the world can't be separated. And just to emphasize the holistic character of those terms, really it's the in that Heidegger is most fixated on. So, right, the in is itself something that can't be thought simply without things that are in other things. So that already gives you a sense, or at least an intimation, of that some sort of whole or holism is in play. Heidegger never used that word, by the way, so this to call what he's doing a kind of holism is not something that he would recognize. And I'll be touching on, just this is all a footnote, but I'll touch on a little bit why he probably wouldn't finally, the totality of his thought, or even the large trajectory of it, the totality is a dangerous term there, have subscribed to what I call holism, but that sort of is something to work out later. But this piece of it certainly fits the description. More specifically, Heidegger, again, famously distinguished between what he called the ready at hand and the present at hand. And there in the notion of the ready at hand, a holistic outlook immediately becomes apparent. What is the ready at hand? It is, according to Heidegger, first the way we, in the most primary and basic way, have dealings with things in the world, and they are dealings that we have in practice. They're not investigations or theorizations of those things. They're dealings that we have in the world through using things in the world and navigating our way around it. And he famously, that is Heidegger, used the example of the wood workshop and how it's organized, and that you have your wood over here, and I'm not a carpenter, I might get this wrong, and your bench over there, and your tools, and somebody who's out work there just moves around grabbing stuff, knows what he or she is doing, and is in fact doing something like, for example, making a chair, which is something for a purpose, and a purpose that's not found in the workshop. But there, that whole situation is articulated as a whole. The idea is that before, here is someone active, doing things with things. The things are there. There's no, right, that you're not going to hit that nail if the hammer isn't there. But they are articulated in different ways and in relation to one another before, well, just as when we use them. And as such, he says, they have a kind of significance, which he calls serviceability. The hammer is good for this, the nails are good for that, the saw, the board, all those things just have a kind of implicit identity as we interact with them. And if you look at your first example on the sheet, to try to make this sort of concrete, less airy, and I'll read it to you quickly. And it's interesting because the example here is a sign, right, of like a signal of a car. In the example of a sign, the difference between the reference of serviceability and the reference of indicating becomes visible in a rough and ready way. These are so far from coinciding that only when they are united does the concreteness of a definite kind of equipment become possible. So what is he saying there? He's saying that you can only have a piece of equipment that signals, that, or as he uses the term, right, indicates, because it's already part of another kind of reference structure that comes about in use. When we are driving, when I am driving, I see somebody signaling left. That's not something I decode, that's something I know. I swerve to the right, especially if you're me in Indiana, and you go past them at a high speed, and that's right, and it's just how you work your way around in the world. I do that with the steering wheel, with the gas pedal, also things I don't think about that are there and part of my overall structure of use. And in that, there are even things whose purpose or function is to refer or indicate, but they can only have that purpose or function because they're already in this matrix of referentiality that comes about through our general using of the world. If that light was, I could see if I was making sense to people, but I'm going to have to assume that I am, at least in a rough and ready way. And so that is the notion of very briefly, the ready at hand. But then let's go next to speech in our more usual sense. Assertoric speech, making claims about things. Heidegger further maintains, right, that all, and this is sort of the big takeaway, that when we talk about things, when we say the hammer is heavy is his famous example, our talk and the meaningfulness of our speech, and I'm not going to use the word meaning because you'll see more why, because it's not clear that there are individual meanings in this setup, but certainly the meaningfulness of my speech emerges out of this context of the ready at hand. That when, right, the hammer, which means that the hammer is something that's already given to me. It's already there beside me. All these things, these Descartes things, these Kant things, how do we know stuff is there? Don't have to worry about it. It's right there. You're hitting stuff with it. It's working fine. It's part of your pre-given world, and it's right? You're always out there next to it, working with it, and then when you say things about it, such as, boy, this hammer is heavy, let me get a lighter one, or go get me a lighter one, Jim. That is there because it is, right, it is part of this world, and it has already come in contact with the beings, with the things there are. So take the next quote on your sheets, And this speaks to the way, above all the things, right? This is famously called the hermeneutic as. Something shows itself as something. That which is disclosed in understanding, that which is understood, is already accessible in such a way that its as which can be made to stand out explicitly. The as makes up the structure of explicitness of something that is understood in dealing with what is environmentally ready to hand, and hopefully what I've been saying makes that phrase more clear. By interpreting it circumspectively, we see it as a table, a door, a carriage, or bridge. As we move around the world interacting with these things, we see them as what they are. They come forward, and then when we speak about them, they are there for our speech. And the issue of, again, reference or representation is, as it were, solved. There's no problem in talking about them. More specifically, and we won't dwell on this too much, because we can't dwell on anything too much, we'll be here all night, but that the assertion, according to Heidegger, has three dimensions, one of which is a pointing out of something, a hammer, a table, a glass of water, Venus. It does not have to be as mundane as these things. The second is, and this is also on your sheet, we'll read in a second, is what it says about that thing, the predication, such as heavy, etc. And then there is always the dimension of showing this thing as what it is to another party. We're always there with people engaged with these things, talking about these things. And it's out of that, right? But you have to see, well, we are, you'll see it's 4 is where, I'm not going to read it right now, is where he defines assertion. But the thing you have to see is so that on the one hand, the things come out to us, we understand them, that's a key word for him. We know we don't write the hammer is not some mysterious object we have to perform an analysis on. We know what these things are. He speaks about the heaviness of it being something that we arrive at by dimming down the other relations and the other parts of the whole in which we find ourselves. But so reference things that are things to be spoken about. They're there for us. There are no problems such as the idealist problems. How do we know they're there? How do we get to them? On the other hand, they're not purely intuitive, right? They come already sliced and diced, if you will. They have, right, they've already, and I've been insisting that the things that are really there, we don't want to pretend they're not there. It is in that sense a kind of realism, but obviously in vast space, there are no hammers, there are none, right? These things already have a significance and a meaning. They're pre-understood when they come forward. And in that way, even as it is a kind of realism, it's not a naive realism, or it's not one where language and understanding and speech don't make a difference. They do. But as we'll see further as we unpack this notion of holism, but the difference they make is so wrapped up with the things that we can't take them apart. We can't tell one from the other. But here you can see that for Heidegger, right, that we're situated amidst the things, amidst ourselves, among the speaking about things, that they're in a way, right, they're sort of three dimensions of this footstool that can never exist without the other, but that indeed give us a way of speaking about things as they are, and even truth and making true claims about them, and solve a lot of those problems, again, without positing other dimensions that raise new problems of their own. Again, we can talk, you'll see more versions of this, but the point is that by coming out of these holes, by being pre-given, both that they are and what they are is available to us. There's a final point about the Heidegger I want to make, which comes forward in 5 and 6 on your sheets. And the first this has to do with the status still of the assertion of, does everybody know what I mean? But when saying something, the hammer is heavy, the light is too bright, any of those kinds of things, right, are assertions. And Heidegger says when, and this is in quote 5, right, that in the assertion, when we bring something forward, the kind of, not it, but the kind of being it has, and this takes us back to the beginning, it changes. It no longer has this ready-at-hand being, right? We lose sight of the context and the holds that allowed us to have a thing and have a thing meaningfully in the first place. And instead we end up with something he calls present at hand, a hammer that's just there that we make claims about. And that the assertion has that, does that work of changing over the status of the ready at hand to the present at hand. Furthermore, he says in 6, right, grammar sought its foundation in the logic of logos, but this logic was based upon the ontology of the present at hand, the basic stock of categories of signification, which passed over into the subsequent science of language, and which in principle is still accepted today, remains oriented toward discourse as assertion. So not only did assertion cover over these fundamental reference relations, but then logic and the logic of the logos, all of you saw this happen first in the sophists, and then in Aristotle, took both things present at hand and language as something present at hand as a starting point, and thereby covered over the nature of discourse, speech, and language themselves. And both of these points are important. The second one is important because all of the holism, or the holists at which we'll look, share that conviction that the way we think about language and speech, the way, at least at this point, it is second nature to us, covers over how it actually functions. And it gives us a misleading picture of how things like meaning, discourse, speech, and even language work. The other point about the assertion is actually a more difficult point and varies even among the authors I'm going to treat today. I'll just mark what's at stake in it, namely, in other words, so let's say that when we say the hammer is heavy or the water is glistening or something like that, we've changed our relation, the reference relation. It still is the case that assertions, propositions, sentences tend to be what are true or not true. And in a way, the status of the assertion is in miniature the status of theorein in general, of theoretical truth. And so the question of what then do we say about the assertion and the kind of truth it brings with it is a question that the Heidegger analysis raises. The whole notion of being in the world, of the holistic, is that there is a deeper and more fundamental being in the truth, as Heidegger sometimes called it at that epoch, that we allows for both meaningful discussion of as well as actual apprehension of things around us, but then when it does get translated into these statements, what sort of career sense, value, valence comes with that is a question that for the moment I'm just going to flag as a question and a problem to think about. But then, provisionally then, I hope you're at least beginning to see the outline of what I am calling holism and what Heidegger gives us, that, again, there is that world and things in it, on the one hand, are inseparable from our speech and our discourse and our language. We're always already out there beside them, and it is not, in fact, able to reckon on them without our relation to things. But on the other hand, the things are always already geared and grooved into our speaking. There's not, right, it's a chicken. There's not, neither has priority, and it is indeed that whole from which we always already begin. Wittgenstein, look at your sheet. We're going to just narrow down, in part, I haven't been reading so much Wittgenstein lately, but also it's a big, these are all, right, macrologia, big discourses, but this is a quotation from the Investigations, where the point, or hope at least, is that you'll see a similar kind of holism arise in Wittgenstein. I'll read it. If language is to be a means of communication, there must be agreement not only in definitions, but also, queer as this may sound, in judgments. It is one thing to describe methods of measurement and another to obtain and state results of measurement. But what we call measuring is partly determined by a certain constancy in results of measurement. So what is he saying there? What's he saying? No, I have to answer. That, right? That you have there, you can again see a sort of interaction between word and world, or speech and world. He's saying it, right? That if the world was not already a certain way, there could be no measuring. There already, right, there already has to be a kind of suitability for measuring built into the world, and therefore without which we could not have, and here it's a specific practice that is the whole, we could not have the practice of measuring, and we could not have or make the kind of statements, the kind of speech, this is 6 inches high, etc., that we do. So that without the world, we would not, in the first place, have this kind of speaking. On the other hand, again, of course, there's no measuring in itself. Without our speaking, there would be none of these things that are measurable. So there's in advance, a kind of interlocking and fittingness of word and world, of our speech and the way things are, that then out of which both our interaction with specific things, specific instances of measuring, as well as the findings and the statements we make about things come about. Because, of course, you could always be wrong about this. So, with luck, you see then that, again, in the context of a practice, right, in advance, they've, as it were, certain aspects of the world and certain aspects of language have already mutually penetrated each other and cannot be taken back apart. And that's what this practice presupposes. And so again, we see a kind of holistic outlook, a kind, right, that you cannot take either of these things without the other, emerging that's least parallel to that of Heidegger. That's fairly cursory, but we're going to be cursory with this. But there are two more aspects of it that I want to bring forward, one of which part has to do with things about what Wittgenstein's saying that always intrigued me, or which really puzzled me until I found out more about the background he was working with. And this is something that Wittgenstein takes from the Austrian logician Gottlob Frege, and that actually Heidegger to some extent took from Frege as well, though the second thing is not in Heidegger. Namely this, that for Wittgenstein, and this is not even wholly true of Frege and Heidegger, people sometimes talk about it, well, that the sentence rather than the word is the primary unit of meaning. And this is an interesting thought in itself. In places Wittgenstein says that, you know, names only name, words only mean things in a sentence. And that's sometimes called the context principle. And it's contrasted with the composition principle, which is the way people more often think of a sentence as made up of individual words, each of which have a meaning. They're put together, they compose, and the whole that they compose is the meaning of the sentence, right? So the hair has a white tail, right? We know what the hair, we know what it has, we know what a white tail is, and we put those things together and we get the meaning of our whole sentence. For parts of Frege, for Wittgenstein, it's the other way, and these things don't have to be mutually but that there's a way at least of thinking about, and this I think is true also of Heidegger, and the reason why the assertion and the statement is so important to him, is that the sentence is primary. Words only mean really what they mean in use. They only have their senses in sentences, and we're going to hear more, because this guy Davidson gets rid of language altogether, we're going to hear more about that. But so sure there are dictionaries, but those are always just abstractions from what we do in use, and we'll talk more about their status. So that's the first thing, sometimes called the context principle, the priority of the sentence. The other thing, which is worth knowing, is that you can then get this way of defining concepts. And in the case, we'll stick with Frege, concepts were things, because he thought of the sentence as a function that took variables, and the concept was, for example, something like is a chair, and then your variables were this is a chair, that is a chair, and depending on what variables you threw in there, your sentence was true or false. Does that make sense to people? So the whole phrase is a chair is a concept. And Frege then went this next step and said you could define concepts by their extensions. That is to say, by the set of all the things that they were true of. So that rather than have a meaning for the phrase, and Frege thought, by the way, that concepts also have meaning, but people in this tradition who came after Frege said, oh, this is cool. We don't have to worry about meanings at all. We can define things extensionally. We can use, right, so concepts then just become ways of dividing up the world. All the things that are true, right, that every variable that makes that set, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that are all fit and make the sentence X is a chair true, that set is the extension of the concept it is a chair, and you can define that concept by that extension. Now what happens when more than one, when concepts have the same extension, which could have, we're not going to go into that, you're lucky, I'm lucky, but there's an account of that. But still, the main idea is that you don't have to have meaning at all in that case in the way we think about it. You have at least a logical formula for getting around it. So that was something that Heidegger did not go there, but he did, I think, at least at this level, and he has, and we'll talk more, account of language and word as well, but it's a different sort of account, and for these kinds of situations, I think he is, as is Wittgenstein, more on the side of the context principle, that the sentence is the basic unit of meaning. Which also then gives us another hole, because right now, words only have their meanings in the context of sentences. Sentences only have meanings in the context of larger practices like measuring. Those only work in the larger context, finally, of words, world, and things and beings like ourselves. So it's holes within holes within holes. And so context principle goes along with holism. All right, so I need to get that out there in order to talk about our last victim, as it were, Donald Davidson, because these guys, they were hearing this, who knows what they think. So Davidson is interesting because, on the one hand, and this is an issue, we'll press it a little more now, that he uses a holistic perspective to define or isolate the meaningfulness of language. Again, a way of understanding how words and world work together. But then it's really, at least, it's with Davidson that the snake bites its own tail, and that the linguistic turn really gets rid of language altogether. That becomes, and we'll see why, that led by his thinking about how language at work works in our speech, because of his kind of holism, he's led to just get rid of the concept of language, at least as a philosophical concept, as one that does this kind of work that people think it does or could do in philosophy, or for that matter, literary criticism, to get rid of that altogether. We like him for that. Or it's at least intriguing. So, and Davidson, just as Wittgenstein is said to follow from Frege in some ways not, and Heidegger from Husserl in some ways not, Davidson in some way comes on the heels of this fellow Willard Van Orman Quine, who was an extensionalist and did think we just get rid of meanings, just deal with extensions. He has a famous essay on why bachelor and unmarried man are not synonyms. And it was cool. But anyway, we won't go there. But I bring it up because though Davidson sometimes speaks of he's not an extensionalist either, which, as I said, I don't think Heidegger is, but he has been known to put the phrase meaningfulness without meanings. And in general, the linguistic turn follows that course, that it's not like you want to turn everything into these little formulas and have them dance around the auditorium the way some of the mathematical logicians did, that we're going to hear more about them, but that the notion that in addition to chairs and plants and human beings and lights and comets, there are another set of things called meanings, and that are as easily identified and readily identified and as discretely identified as all the things. The linguistic term generally, including me on this, doubt that meaning is another kind of thing in the world, along, if you counted all the things, and then you count their names, and then you count the meanings of their names, that is a question. That is, so part of the force of the linguistic term, is what I'm trying to say, is this sort of bracketing of meaning as an entity, this distancing, again, not to say there isn't meaningfulness, and we'll talk more about how that works, but meanings per se are not one of the things of which our universe is composed. And so Davidson wants then to try to give an account of understanding in speech and semantics in this context, and meaningfulness. And following Quine in some way, he starts from the case of translation and what is sometimes called radical translation. Where one speaker understands another speaker, or tries to, who does not know anything about that speaker's world or language. Maybe you're experiencing me right now, So radical translation, one unit, one individual encountering another, taken to be speaking, but you don't know anything about their language and you don't know anything about their culture. And in Davidson, and that is something that was a starting point, it was something Quine played around with famously. But in Davidson, the idea, it's really, it sort of does a kind of clearing of the decks so you can see more precisely what is going on. And that moment of translation, it doesn't always have to be radical, stands for any kind of understanding of one speaker by another. So what is going on when you understand me now is going to be understood in some way on this model of, can you translate me? Can you say in your words what I am saying? And we'll see how that works further in a second. The other piece of the puzzle, perhaps sadly we need to know a little about, is the work of the Polish logician Alfred Tarski. I'm not an expert on this, but I'll give it to you as best I can. We're not getting bogged down in him. And Tarski famously answered Pilate's question, right? What is truth? But the good news is he only did it for formalized languages using what's called convention T. And this, by the way, this was, to go back, there was a reason I went on about this, it was an extensional definition of truth, for a given language, a formal language. So he said, take one language, a first language, L. Then in a second language, a meta-language, as it's called, if you can describe all the sentences in L and state in the meta-language their truth conditions, that total set is the definition of truth for that first language, which is called convention T. It's right, it's what, just as all the things that made blank as a chair true defined what is a chair is. So in this case, all the things that make truth true, that the snow is white is true, all those cases give you an extensional definition of truth. I'm looking, I hope I still have, look at your handout, this is the classic, and it gives you example of one of these so-called Tarskian truth sentences. That'll work, because we don't need a lot out of this. It's not a huge, but it's sort of cool in its own way anyway. So, right, if you look at that sentence, so here we're going to say that the first language, L, is French, and the second language is English, and in a minute we're going to find out why this really doesn't work, but we will pretend it does for a moment. And so, right, do you see under 8, 9 we are, Tarskian truth sentence. We'll need 8 in a second. La neige blanche. So the first side takes, right, it describes a sentence, the snow is white in French, and that's why it's in quotation marks, and says the snow and white is true if and if, only if snow is white. And that's not in quotation marks. Right? So that's a Tarskian truth sentence in another, and you take the set of all those sentences, and you have a definition for truth in the original language. Now, obviously, right, to start, the truth sentence, right, does not seem to say a lot, right? Right? But that's where our first step, and it's only our first step because Davidson moves very far off of this, so don't worry. But it's already gives us a sense of the holistic force, because it's not right. Any one of these sentences on its own is not very important. But the idea is that you can get all of them, and you can in formalized languages, certain kinds, not all of them are closed, but some are. You can get all the sentences and all their truth conditions. And as a whole, that is informative of the language. Further, Tarski said that, and there were things he called satisfaction conditions. So it had to do with like how snow and 6 inches won't fit together in a sentence. Only certain kinds of things are candidates for certain kinds of truth statements. And that gives you a view of the semantics of the language. It's how meaning is distributed there as well as truth. But it's only done within the set, the whole set of these truth sentences, not any one of them. So already we have a kind of intimation of holism. Hold that thought. So that said, if that makes just a kind of working truth, and the other thing, just right, it's worth flagging. So what's kind of silly about this? If you go back to 9, right? So la neige is blanche is just that's just mentioning your sentence in French. And then you say, if it is true, that sentence is true, if and only if snow is white. And that's in English, right? That's stating a fact. And it looks like, well, this is silly, because snow, right, that's just sort of saying what the damn thing said. But the point is that the truth condition is expressed in language, goes back to what I was talking about, that even if this is a realism, because it's about truth, it is not a naive realism. Right, the truth that makes these sentences true already has a linguistic component. Here it's a translation of the French, what makes it true, into the English. And so that is how he constructed these, right? The French sentence is true if and only if, and then you state what would make it true in the English. The good good news, however, and now I'm going to tell you two differences of the Davidson from this that will, with luck, bring what he's really thinking into view. So the first one, and that's on 8, is that he inverts, that is Davidson, what Tarski does. Tarski defines truth for a language in a second language. In doing that, he assumes actually the translatability of what La Neige Blanche says in French into English. He assumes the translatability of the first language into the second. The snow is white. What conditions? Davidson goes the other way. He uses the postulation of truth and a common truth to negotiate the translation between the two languages. So that, let me see, to give you, right? So that he holds truth constant when I'm talking to you, or even when I'm talking to somebody else whose language I don't know, the guy saying La Neige Blanche, when we both know how the ideas we share some kind of working truth about the world that lets us move one statement, his statement, into my statement. And again, and this is why, and it is, let's see if we have it here. Good. So that, and again, right, you have to see the holistic part. All right, and I can make this clear in a second. So that, and it's not, right, it's not any given statement, but it's all the statements. The truth works across the whole of your language and the whole of my language as a way of orienting, the way of mapping your language into my language. I'll give you an example that might make that more concrete, and that is also, hopefully opens the door. I mean, the funny thing about these truth statements, right, is if you take something like the one we had, La Neige Blanche, is true, and then you put if and only if grass is green. That works, as long as grass is green. Does that make sense to people, right? Right? La Neige Blanche, right? It totally works. So it's not at the level of the statement, it's the level of all the statements, right? When it's the ideas that over time, like if I say, well, and maybe it's true in this one that we're finding out, right? We only get snow when the grass isn't green. Then we have another sentence that uses our terms that's going to come into conflict with the idea the snow is white only if the grass is green. And we're going to start rearranging the patterning of our understanding of the language. Does that make sense to people? So that it's only in all the different things that a speaker says that you begin to fix, again, through the common, well, I know what snow is, I know what grass is, and again, you can't use those words in those terms, but that we have a shared world that we can cash out in those terms, that I can capture the pattern of your language in my language, I can learn your language through mapping the shared world we have, mapping the various things that you are inclined to say onto the various things I am inclined to say. Does it make working sense to people? So I'm going to say, right, I am inclined to say, right, the snow is white. You're saying, right, La Neige Blanche. Maybe we have, but that's only a beginning point because you say lots of other junk. I say lots of other junk, but over again, it's a holistic motion, and it's all in speech. There's no, right, unlike an earlier positivism, which thought, oh, you just have to point to this stuff. Here, it's all in discourse and conversation of a kind that you then capture the meaningfulness of the other's discourse in your own. So the first point is then, and you can only do that because somehow you have a common world. When it's snowing, you don't think the guy is saying, the grass is white, right? You just don't look for that. But again, you always have So that's the first thing. Truth is constant. Translation is accomplished through it. You're not defining truth. You're using it as a pivot to understand the other. But the second point, which gets fun, if you're me, but hopefully if you're you, is that we don't speak formalized languages, right? Right. So that means there's no closed set of things you can say or I can say. Right? The Tarski thing, he had a hole because there really are in some cases, or you can construct something where there's only a certain number of propositions you can generate. Hear that in real life natural language, that's not true. So what does this mean? It seems to conflict with the first point. On the one hand, we have to feel our way through the whole force of the other's discourse and my own discourse, and I'm trying to think of the things I say and you say. Yet there is no closure to that. So, but that's Davidson's point, that really is, he speaks of a prior theory of what your language is, a prior theory of mine, but that we are always, when we speak to one another, even not in radical translation, coming to our discussion with what you could say are different traditions. We all have a history of usage. You of your usage, my of my usage. Some of it overlaps. I think of trees certain ways, you think of it, maybe we have. But then at that moment, we have to translate and capture the force of each other's discussion, always with an eye to what kind of truth you might be speaking, or I might be speaking if you're understanding me. And so at that moment, we're always, right, we're always there, right, we're always engaging, again, in a sort of holistic reinterpreting the whole of what a speaker's meaningfulness is on the basis of our own, again, and they are not, there's no set beginning point. That is, we don't start with a reservoir of shared meanings, and we are sorting them out between each other, again, with an eye to what you could possibly be saying that could possibly be meaningful and true to my way of understanding the world. So let's take, right, an example, and this is, right, and one place it comes up is in what we would call metaphor, but Davidson doesn't really think that case is different from the case we're in, right? The famous Romeo's remark, Juliet is the sun. Davidson's idea, right, is that it's not like we know already what the sun is, no less who Juliet is, and then so we have a literal meaning that we then try to find a figural meaning for, is we just fit, well, she's the sun, man. You know, like that. We have to make sense of that, right? And in that case, if you think about it, there is, there is not necessarily the case any translation simply is going to be at, right? It's just, what does that really, I mean, if you put it in context, you can start playing it out, but it sort of kind of means she's everything to me, right? I mean, it doesn't, right? That's why the metaphor is so powerful. But that is, again, that is what Davidson, not in degree, our speech differs, but in kind, all our speaking is like that. Everything we say is in that moment of speaking needs to be engaged with and interpreted with an eye to what it could possibly be meaning, and is in effect a kind of new usage. Or take, right, the sentence which seems less radical, right, that people believe the sun went around the earth because it looks that way, right? You might know that Wittgenstein famously said, well, what would it really look like then if it really looked like the earth went around the sun, right? But there Wittgenstein is being a kind of literalist, because, right, the sun, if the sun is defined as the star that all the planets orbit around, then somebody said a very stupid thing when they said it really looks that way. But on a Davidsonian model, you would try to see what it is they were seeing when they said that. And in that case, the sun couldn't mean then the star that all the planets go around. It has to have, and again, it won't have necessarily a fixed or a Fermi. You'll interpret it in terms of the whole sentence. So the Davidson, right, and it's from there you can see already that his claim is, right, and this is on your sheet, that this is what we always do. I'm trying to keep an eye on my time here. I'll try to wrap it up in a minute. Right, if you look. So from this, so really what is always going on are these, right, again, it's kinds of open interpretations. It's not like we don't speak, right? We are speakers of a language we have experience with. We've got a lot of other sentences with, we've said a lot of things, and you've said a lot of things about the sun, and I've said a lot of things, and a lot of things about Juliet and Romeo, but we haven't all said the same things. And we then extrapolate and interact with one another and with how things are in order to make sense of one another. And on that basis, Davidson, rejects explicitly, right, that there is a thing as language in a philosophically significant way, right? Look at 10. I conclude that there is no such thing as a language, not if a language is anything like what many philosophers and linguists have supposed. There is no such thing to be learned, mastered, or born with. We must give up the idea of clearly defined shared structure. So that's the idea. I mean, it's not that there aren't dictionaries. It's not like we're going to cancel one of your tutorials. It's just that there is not a, right, that in a philosophically probative way, there's not rules. For the moment of speech, there's no, and nor structure as the structuralists had it, there's not, or conventions that dictate what happens when speaking happens. When meaningfulness occurs, it's always this three-way interpretation between us, things, and world, which gets us back to a point that is not very far from the Heidegger one we began from. All right, so that's, but we got rid of language, isn't that cool? All right, so just to wrap up, and we can talk more about this question, I mean, there's two issues at least to flag. I mentioned this, and I'll just mention them to find them. All right, I mean, one is that literature, and I'm gonna jump away from this, but I'll at least flag it. Certainly in the Davidson model, which does take seriously sentences and propositional truth, and which, right, so here, truth, and not, right, again, not some preformed truth really as an orienting value, or even, or what Heidegger would say, being in the truth, an ability to say true things and have a world that we can talk about, is privileged for speech. The question becomes, what's the status of literature? Literature, which is usually understood as fiction, or as, right, it's the as what is not true. So how do you account for literary discourse on this kind of holistic model, especially the kind that Davidson puts forward? And it's a question, I have some thoughts about answers to it. Let's bracket those for a moment to say one other thing, and it'll sort of get us back to the answer, also get us to the end of the talk, so isn't that handy? But the point is this. The other thing is that holism as a way of thinking about language, sometimes I think it's language, not language, goes along in my own thinking with this term historicity, which I would define as history that's not history, just as this is a version of language that's not language, or a version of linguistic term that's not linguistic term. And these issues have to do, right, and again, interpreting literature historically, or other kinds of intellectual history. How do we think about history? And because this takes us back to both Heidegger and Wittgenstein, who I think you could say roughly, perhaps somewhat unfairly, but I think not wholly, form two opposite poles. Heidegger didn't have a huge problem with literature, and he spoke in other ways both about language, die Sprache, and words, das Wort, because he thought that literature's task ultimately was to disclose a way of being in the world historically, in a somewhat new meaning of history for human beings. Or when it wasn't, he began to think maybe nothing was really up to that task. So if it couldn't disclose a new way of dwelling in the world, it could at least foment a receptivity to a new ways of being in the world, that we could await other ways of inhabiting our historical being. And Heidegger thought, no one thought in some ways, even in Being in Time, especially in Being in Time, more profoundly about history and historical categories. The word historicity comes from Heidegger in important ways. At the same time, he, that is Heidegger, still spoke of history in terms of periods and ages and epochs in a way that goes back to a tradition in history that he also criticized. But so, in some way, still literature, the greatest literature, Holderley and others, were to be world historical, world disclosive for our time. The other extreme, Wittgenstein, who didn't think there was anything to say about history, right? There's just shut up, right? And so in that way, right, and there was limits to what you could say meaningfully, and didn't seem to feel that it was possible or right to say more than that, and in that way shared, even though a certain bent with the positivists and the positivism with which he was sometimes allied, who wanted to establish the limits of meaningful discourse. So in Heidegger, we have these huge historical ambitions. In Wittgenstein, we have zero historical ambitions. And what I call historicity is an attempt to come down between those two. And it goes back to the Davidson and where we left off, in that just as we were saying that any time we speak with one another, there's your tradition and my tradition of usage interacting and intersecting and coming to some kind of understanding. So this notion would be in reading or interpreting a work of literature. We again have that same kind of double interpretive staging, where I am looking at the usage, like the last thing, that astonishing sentence by Marion Moore that some of you discussed on Wednesday, right, which is a single sentence from her poem, The Fish. And I'm also bringing my concerns, right, and this is Davidsonian, my questions, my sense of the truth, but here at a very much higher order. And again, there's two sorts of like an interpretive cross-hatching, and we're looking for the meaningfulness, and you can do it in different ways, right? You can look at the sentence in the context of the poem. You can look at, right, this is again building up what kind of tradition you would need to analyze this work. Or you could look at the poem in the context of all of Marion Moore's poems. You could look at it in the context of what's called objectivism, other people who wrote like her. You could look at it in the context of the history of lyric poetry, right there. These would all be sequences of usages, just like, or Plato, you could interpret a sentence, a dialogue, all the dialogues, Plato and Aristotle. And so you're looking, and in some ways it's closer to Tarski's formalized language, because these guys are dead and they're not going to generate any more sentences. So you have something of a closed system. And then you have your sense and your understanding. And the idea is that these are, and your question, and you can learn a new question from them, but that they are all interpretation, including literary interpretation, is this kind of two traditions intersecting. And by the way, and it doesn't, right, and there's no fixed reference point to how much or at any moment, right? Really, it's again in the event of understanding and peeling back some truth, finally, that goes to work. And so here, this sentence from the Moore, which I like, but I have some ideas how to read it, in part by looking very carefully at the sentence and what it says and how it puts together things like animals being forceful and statisticians that you wouldn't put together. But also because I have been thinking and asking questions about these problems of form and force in language that sort of dovetail and intersect such that I can make sense out of this. And it's right, and so it would be this way of interpreting that embodies the kind of holistic outlook that finally we found in Davidson, but that also works for inserting ourselves and relating ourselves to history, intellectual history, into the various, and that's sort of the difference from Gadamer, but we won't go there, traditions that we all confront and that you at St. John's study so well. All right, so that's it. Thank you.